wholesale gas prices are now at the highest level that we've seen since April 2023.
Are they living in reality here?
No, and their economies are not doing great.
That's really bad for Europe's economies, which are basically still struggling to come out of recession.
Europe has been in an energy crisis for years. According to Eurostat, electricity prices for household consumers peaked at 0.24 euros per kilowatt hour in the second half of 2022. For non-household consumers, prices peaked at 0.215 euros per kilowatt hour in the first half of 2023. This fluctuation of household electricity prices affected the entire euro area, some more than others.
Our monthly bill is around $160 despite minimal usage, as we're almost always out of the house.
He is stocking up his yard with firewood to stay warm through winter.
This price volatility has been a concern for years, but it intensified even more during global events like the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. And while we think the worst is over and the prices have started to stabilize, the new year came with new surprises for the entire region.
President-elect Donald Trump is threatening the European Union with tariffs if member countries don't buy more American oil and gas.
President Zelensky will years of gas supplies from Russia to Europe sent via Ukraine have come to an end, marking an end of an era in the European Union.
The country's government has announced a 60-day state of emergency in response to the energy crisis.
In this video, we're taking you through 4 major events between December 2024 and January 2025, which will prove why Europe can't escape the energy crisis in 2025. When we say that Europe is facing an energy crisis, we mean there's an imbalance between the supply and demand of energy in the region. This balance was maintained for a long time, and it was hard to tell if there were fluctuations in between. But in the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a historic plunge in global energy consumption, which means there was less demand, meaning the prices of many fuels dropped to their lowest levels in decades. But since then, the demand has rebounded strongly due to an exceptionally rapid global economic recovery and a cold and long winter in the Northern Hemisphere, which raised the demand for heating. And when this demand went up, there was a weaker than expected increase in supply. So with high demand and low supply, a region has no choice but to raise prices on gas, coal, and electricity, which is what happened in the European Union and has been happening for quite some time. Before we dive into the 4 major events that intensified the energy crisis in Europe, we have to understand that of the total energy supply in the euro area, 62.5% of it is fulfilled by imports. In 2021, Russia was the biggest exporter of LNG and pipeline gas to the EU with 150.2 billion cubic meters, nearly 40% of the EU imports. At number 2 is Norway, at number 3 is North African countries, and the United States at number 4. But in just 1 year, the year when the Russia-Ukraine war started, everything changed. In 2022, Russian imports were halved, leaving space for Norway and the United States to up their supply. And by 2023, Russia's gas and LNG only accounted for 8% of the total EU imports, making Norway the biggest contributor, followed by the United States, and then other countries like Qatar. This makes the region heavily reliant and extremely vulnerable to global events, especially if those events are in the top 3 supply partners. In the nearly 3 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Qatar has provided between 12 to 14% of Europe's LNG, which is a total of 37.1 million metric tons of LNG. As the EU brought on other import partners to stabilize their supply, they realized that they needed some framework to regulate this selection and ensure their ethical background, so they did. In April 2024, the European Parliament voted for a new law called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This law requires larger companies operating in the bloc to check if their supply chains use forced labor or cause environmental damage. The directive places new requirements on companies to fully audit upstream partners in design or manufacture and downstream partners who transport, store, and distribute products. EU lawmakers backed this law by 374 votes, but there were also 235 against, with 19 abstentions. Business groups have complained that it introduces multiple new layers of regulatory burden with potentially harsh sanctions.
I just have to note for the record that it is important that we do not allow Europe to become the standard setters for the United States.
According to the law, penalties include fines of up to 5% of global turnover, which scrutinizes the partners involved. In December 2024, Qatar Energy's CEO and Minister of Energy, Saad Al-Kaabi, threatened to stop EU gas sales if they were fined under this due diligence directive. Qatar Energy already has long-term supply contracts with major European companies, including Shell, Total Energies, and Eni, all of which would take a huge hit if gas sales were halted. According to figures from the data provider Kepler, Qatar's revenues in 2023 from the EU sales were 188.5 billion Qatari riyals, or $51.6 billion. So if they are fined under this law, 5% of that would be $2.5 billion.
Are you telling us, I don't want your LNG into the EU? Because I'm not going to supply EU with LNG to support their requirements for energy and then be penalized with my total revenue worldwide going to EU.
He said Qatar would not break its existing LNG contracts, but it would look at legal avenues if it faced hefty penalties and would not agree to ship new supplies.
And in that case, should I pull my investment out of EU, or should I actually not invest and look at another company that is in another country?
Now, this doesn't mean that Qatar Energy is engaged in any form of forced labor or violating any environmental damage. It just means that the EU has a stronger stance on climate change than the Middle East, according to the Climate Change Performance Index of 2025. But it is ironic how a region that doesn't have global domestic production gets to judge others who do.
Of course, the Europeans have also just come through an energy crisis. They continue to have war on their doorstep, and they need all the energy that they can get. So are they living in reality here?
No, and their economies are not doing great. So they need foreign direct investments, and they need support. And how do you fuel growth? You fuel growth with energy.
The European Union has not yet released an official statement. However, if Qatar Energy is fined, they may terminate their 27-year deals with European majors, which were scheduled to begin around 2026 and 2027. To prevent the energy crisis from worsening, the EU must make amends with Qatar and other partners with whom they have similar deals, especially the United States.
I still hope to convince the next U.S. administration that we have everything to lose from a collective trade war.
In 2023, the United States was the largest LNG supplier to the EU, representing almost 50% of total LNG imports. This number compared to the 2021 imports from the U.S. is almost tripled, and from a historical perspective, the U.S. has been their go-to LNG provider since 2016, seeing as the U.S. is competing with countries like Norway and Qatar as the suppliers for the EU. They decided to up the ante by giving them an ultimatum.
President-elect Donald Trump is threatening the European Union with tariffs if member countries don't buy more American oil and gas. In a Truth Social post, Trump saying if the EU does not make up its deficit with the United States, quote, it's tariffs all the way.
Despite being the biggest supplier to the EU, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump demands that the European Union step up U.S. oil and gas imports or face tariffs on the bloc's exports. Ironically, there are no extra volumes available as the United States is exporting at capacity, but Trump has pledged to further grow the country's oil and gas production.
So I think, Trump's putting himself in a place where he can almost make his point and declare victory.
Even so, the European Commission said it was ready to discuss with Trump how to strengthen what it described as an already strong relationship, including in the energy sector. But that's easier said than done, considering his recent remarks regarding the Greenland threat. They have to make this decision before January 20th, as it'll be the day Trump takes office. German and Italian car exports currently face a 2.5% U.S. tariff, which could quadruple if Trump makes good on his threats. Hopefully, the EU will come to a decision well before this trigger-happy president starts calling up the bill. While these types of challenges can be expected from partners like the US and Qatar, it's almost unbelievable that Norway, one of the most reliable suppliers of the EU, could contribute to the crisis. From the 1970s oil crisis to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Norway has been a dependable partner of oil and gas for over 50 years. Norway's largest oil and gas operator, Equinor, has become the largest supplier of energy to Europe. Just when it seemed their supply was secure, unfortunately, they encountered an unexpected challenge. On January 2, 2025, Equinor's Hammerfest LNG plant, which is located in Arctic northern Norway, suffered an unexpected outage due to a compressor failure. This plant can deliver about 6.5 million cubic meters of gas per year, enough to supply about 6.5 million European homes and accounts for roughly 5% of all Norwegian gas exports. But since January 2nd, all the outputs have been stopped. It's too soon to tell when this issue will be resolved, especially when on January 9th, another Equinor spokesperson claimed it would take another 10 days to restore operations. That's 3 weeks of no gas from a major supplier, and it's sending ripples of worry across Europe. Just when you thought things couldn't get any tighter, we found another source that just went offline. If you recall the EU imports, you may have noticed that Russian imports haven't fully ended. They've only been limited. That is because the EU knows that they can't just end Russian imports immediately, and that they need other partners to fill the void as they slowly phase out Russian gas. The irony here is that the opposite happened in 2024. To understand this, let's first note that in this 42.9 billion cubic meters of Russian exports, 25.1 billion cubic meters is Russian gas through pipelines, and 17.8 billion cubic meters is LNG. Now, according to Rystad Energy, in 2024, Europe bought a record amount of LNG from Russia, around 24.2 billion cubic meters, which is up by more than 6 billion cubic meters from 2023. Europe also brought in 49.5 billion cubic meters of Russian gas through pipelines, which is 7 billion cubic meters higher than last year. So much for standing with Ukraine. Another irony to note here is that one of the pipelines, the Urengoy-Pomary-Uzhgorod pipeline, literally runs through Ukraine. For years, this pipeline has been one of the very few that have been serving Europe, but those days are over.
President Zelensky, well, years of gas supplies from Russia to Europe sent via Ukraine have come to an end, marking an end of an era in the European Union.
On January 1st, 2025, Ukraine ceased the transit of Russian gas through its territory by halting the pipeline's flow. Gazprom, one of Russia's gas giants, earned approximately $6 billion annually from this pipeline, and Ukraine previously earned around $3 billion annually at the peak of transit volumes in the 2000s, well before the construction of Nord Stream. But all that comes to an end with this move by Ukraine, a move which is heavily criticized.
Aby Slovensko bolo takouto trávou, ako to vidíme v týchto dňoch pri zastavení tranzitu plynu cez Ukrajinu, čo bude mať drastické dopady na nás všetkých v Európskej únii, len nie na Ruskú federáciu.
Slovakia was one of the countries that not only benefited from the pipeline, but now they're threatening to cut Ukraine's electricity supply if they close the pipeline. Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, has publicly addressed Zelensky and even called him a beggar and a blackmailer.
Chodí po tej Európe, len žobre a vydiera, ostatných pýta peniaze, jednoducho toto musí skončiť. Skúste trošku myslieť aj na túto krajinu.
He's not wrong. With the end of this transit deal, the import-dependent Europe is becoming more vulnerable. However, there's one country in particular that is facing this cutoff in the form of a state of emergency. That country is the Soviet Republic of Moldova.
Pliny Donici is stocking up his yard with firewood to stay warm through winter.
Moldova is one of the world's most energy-insecure countries and has long been reliant on Russian gas transited through Ukraine. Moldova is one of the 3 countries in Europe that rely 100% on Russian gas. And to be specific, they relied on the pipeline which was part of the transit deal that ended on New Year. With this immediate cutoff, they have no choice but to declare a state of emergency.
There is a need for wood pellets, and we need more power generators.
Despite Moldova's ties with Russia, they've been trying to get membership in the European Union for quite some time, with the hopes that they can switch from their decade-long Russian partners to new beginnings.
Moldova is already ready for deeper integration in the EU single market.
But with this new energy crisis that is plaguing Moldova, they will only be adding to the import dependency level of the EU.
2025 is the year of Europe's strength. That's the joint declaration by the defense ministers of Poland, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy, who met today near Warsaw.
Although European officials have made optimistic statements at the start of 2025, the energy crisis is far from over. Europe will need to maintain good relationships with its import partners such as Russia, the United States, and Qatar to escape the energy crisis in 2025.